So we previously went through kick drum EQ and kick drum triggering. Let's now, in this video, touch upon the basics of how I go about EQing a snare drum. Now, I'm going to rewind a little bit in the video, mute all of the other tracks, and just start with the drums, go about how I normally build the mix. I am going to go ahead and solo the kick drum that we already got the sound on previously, and then add in the snare drum and go from there. Snare drum doesn't sound too bad with the kick. Let's solo the snare and see how it sounds alone. Okay, so first thing I notice is he's playing a lot of ghost notes in between the backbeat, but there's not a lot of hi-hat bleed into the snare drum mic on this particular drum, but it can be one of the hardest issues to overcome when EQing a snare drum. As you start to add high-end to the snare drum, you're going to generate bleed from the hi-hat and overheads into the snare mic. It's very hard to overcome this problem. Obviously, the snare needs to be brightened. So let's bring up a plugin and increase the high end on the snare and see how much of the bleed from the hi-hat we start generating into the snare mic. I'm going to go grab this SSL EQ, one of my favorite plugins from Waves. Let's start on the high band EQ, anywhere from 8K to 10K, and a little bit of 4K, between 3K and 4K5 I like to add. Let's go ahead and click the bell curve button and start bringing up 8K. Not too bad with the bleed yet. Let's go ahead and bring in some 4K. So you'll notice right away that you start hearing more hi-hat bleeding into the snare mic. Now, you could take back some of the high end, but then you lose the sound on the snare drum. Now, the snare sounds pretty nice. I think it needs to be a little thicker sounding, and most of the time I use between 200 and 220 to fatten up snare drum sounds. In order to get rid of the hi-hat bleed, the normal procedure for most engineers is just to gate the snare drum, but then you lose the nice ghost notes in the background. Let's play a little bit and add some of the 200. You see how that right away fattens up the snare when I bring in that 200 hertz. And it will not get in the way of the bass guitar or the bass drum. So, going back a little bit to the bleed of the hi-hat, if you went and added a gate to the snare, it'll start sounding really artificial when you hear it opening and closing, especially when you add effects to it, like ambience. So the overall EQ of the snare sounds pretty good, but it could be a little bit more snappy and bright. And I don't want to bring up the high end anymore because that's going to give me more of the hi-hat. So I'm going to over-exaggerate and show you what I mean. Okay, so what would be the solution to make the snare bright but not get the hi-hat bleed? My secret weapon is a dynamic EQ, and I found it built into this plugin by Mac DSP on Compressor Bank 3. It has a one-band dynamic EQ section, a compression section, and a pre-filter section, and an output section with a phase button. Now, the key to this plugin is the dynamic EQing. I have a preset that I made, and it's called Auto Snare EQ. And you'll notice it's in dynamic mode, and the gain is all the way up. So this will not EQ the snare until it reaches a certain threshold. Now, in this EQ section, the one-band EQ, there's a frequency, there's a Q adjustment, the gain adjustment, and it's in dynamic mode. We also have the compressor section where you set the threshold on where you want it to EQ. What makes this great is it's only going to EQ the snare when it's hit, so the snare is not being made brighter or EQ'd unless it's hit, leaving all the in-between bleeds, such as the hi-hat, un-EQ'd or not brightened. Let's play a little and I'll show you how it works. Let's leave it in bypass mode. Unbypass. And you'll notice how nice and bright the snare is only when it's hit. All the hi-hat bleed and cymbals are not getting more pronounced. Bypass. That's absolutely killing. This is one of my favorite things to do to a snare drum, to make them really bright and snappy, but not have that bleed and not having to gate the snare and get rid of all those nice ghost notes. Now, this can be done by just side chaining a EQ to a compressor. It's really just a side chained EQ to a compressor. It just happened to be built into this Mac DSP Compressor Bank 3. Now that the snare is sounding pretty damn good, let's go ahead and add a little ambience to it. I have a preset room sound that we set up earlier. Let's unmute it. Yes, that sounds really good. Just by adding that little ambience makes a big difference. We had set that up earlier in previous videos when we set up our aux returns. It's a little room sound. Let's go ahead and play kick and snare together. Let's bring back the room just a hair. Nice. Going to roll back the high end just a little bit at 8K. Wow, that sounds very good, the kick and snare together. I want to touch upon one other thing that's really, really important. Most of us start the mix with the kick and snare. You have to leave yourself some headroom on the master bus or the 2-mix bus. I'm going to bring that down here next to the kick and snare. This has to be the number one issue I find with novice mixers. They start with the drums, but they do not leave enough headroom on the stereo mix bus. By the time they get to the end of the mix, the stereo bus is slamming and they have to bring down the master fader. Wrong way to go about it. Let me take off this limiter I have on the master mix bus and show you that I have left some headroom on my 2-mix bus. Let me make it a little larger. And you'll see that there is some headroom left here. Let's bring in the kick. Now you noticed I did have some headroom left on the mix bus. And in the old analog days with VU meters, I always started my kick and snare about 8 to 10 dB down, and that guaranteed I did not run into trouble later at the end of the mix and have no headroom left. Especially mixing in the box like we are here in Pro Tools, it's really unforgiving when you slam the master bus. On analog consoles, it gives it a sound, and you really didn't have to worry about it too much. But mixing in the box with Pro Tools, have to be very, very careful not to overload the mix bus. Thanks so much for watching. Let's move on to the next video and get into some snare retriggering techniques.